Can you all hear me okay?
Is this a presentation? Sorry. Okay. And then.
Great. So I'm just going to go on and talk. I see in the chat that someone said, yes, we can hear you. So welcome everyone. And I am really very appreciative of this opportunity. So what I wanted to do by way of just really quick introduction is, I guess you can see the slides now, and I come to you today with regard to my work with the U.S. Human Rights Network. I'm a longtime member and also currently serving as a board member, also as a member of the U.S. Human Rights Cities Alliance. My background, I actually was the president of the National Conference of Black Lawyers for a couple of years, a few years ago, as the first non-lawyer president for that really revolutionary, very, very progressive legal arm of the Black Revolution is how they started, basically initially back in the 60s to help at a moment much like today to protect the Black Panthers, protect activists who were simply trying to protect Black lives and demand self-determination. They were over-policed, over-incarcerated. Many of them are still in prison for life. So this is just a really important reminder on this weekend of Juneteenth, and I was happy to be able to participate. So if you share the first slide, I'm really going to start with just one of many, many images here that many of us are bombarded with in the media these days. But this says it all. Right? Just too many names to even mention. And hopefully these slides can be shared with participants after the call. Because I only scanned through and I didn't even see some of the names that we know from Chicago. Rekia Boyd, right? Laquan McDonald, Harith Augustus, the barber who was executed. So I just wanted to lift them up and encourage especially our young people and all our allies who are on the front lines to demand change. So next slide, please. Okay, this just really quickly, Racism 101, the prior presentations give a really good backdrop for why we see what we see today, right? Policing Black bodies is necessary to protect, as Attorney Demetrius shared, this incredible resource that we as African descendants have represented from enslavement on. So these numbers are actually from several years ago, but the percentages are what I really wanted to reinforce, because this is just Chicago. And basically what this says is that, and we know this story, a minority of the population, this number was about a third, which actually has shifted because of gentrification and, all the effects of the systemic racism with regard to people's homes, people's access to land and resources. But a third of basically our population at that time represented, if you look all the way over to the right, almost 80% of arrests and incarceration. And this was a youth statistic. So these literally are children and teens, which is genocidal. So that's a thread that I'm going to keep sharing here. The rest of these statistics mentioned same dynamic and all the tools of policing Black bodies and basically reigning terror, just as we heard from the first presentation, from the enslavement of African people and the creation of chattel slavery, which is very, very different from the servitude that existed all around the world for a very long time. These numbers show just even higher majority of the penalties of this police state are rained on Black and brown people, but disproportionately African descendants. You know, I won't even dwell on this, but we've seen this. Some of this is not news to those, the attorneys, the activists, the educators, and here on this call, but it is becoming a wake-up call, as we see, to allies around the world who honestly could not conceive of it, but they're being forced to now with the prevalence of the videos, and just the incessant refusal, especially of our young people, refusal to allow the status quo to continue. Next slide, please. So I'm not sure how many people on this call have seen this image, but it's very, very clear. So not a lot of explanation needed there. Again, policing in the US literally was conceived and has its inception in the period of enslavement and right around Reconstruction. And it literally was started with these, interestingly, civilian militias, and ultimately became, you know, an actual job of the state to employ these very, very brutal policing tactics to control the enslaved people, and often those who were technically free people. We know, free men and women. It did not matter if you were caught either north or south of the Mason-Dixon line. It really didn't matter what the prevailing civil law was at the time. If you were Black, with even a drop of Black blood, you could be sold down river and re-enslaved or enslaved for the first time. So we see that this is the same game. We have many people who speak about the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan, and you know, that badge on the right being very indicative of who has always served in this role. Next slide, please. So despite this very lethal and legal policing of Black bodies, the terrorizing, the control to try to continue to dominate and profit off of Black people, our resistance continues and it grows. So I just pulled a few images there. The top level basically has a lot of images from today, which show a little bit of, you know, the more things change, the more they say the same, but also the progression. So on this Juneteenth weekend, we can see that the voices, the bodies, the participation in this resistance is increasingly multicultural, and that is getting the attention of and also scaring the heck out of the ruling class. So it, you know, when you see that second sign from the left, abolish the police, that would have been an absurd conversation that actually many of us have been having for quite some time. Disarm the police, defund the police, abolish the police, and now it's a much more real and honest conversation for people to literally try to figure out and recommend as we speak some of the ways to do this. So again, all the way to the right, that's one of the Confederate statues that is coming down, and this is global, right? So much like, you know, we heard in the previous two presentations, this backlash against African descendants and African people, self-determination is fierce, but we have always resisted. We always continue to resist. So the bottom row again, part of the more recent foundation of resistance that we've continued to build on. Some of you will recognize that iconic image on the bottom left, this young woman and all the militarized police that we know we're living with now. That was Baton Rouge just after Alton Sterling's execution at the hands of racist police during that particular wave of killing. The second one on the bottom, I placed so that we could think about, again, our youth. This is what prison looks like. It may be a work camp or a youth detention camp. I believe this one is in Mississippi. And this child is literally like an animal. He's hogtied, he's chained, and pretty much immobilized. And this is what, if a young person is, it's equivalent to being sold down the river, right? Just like I talked about back when, you know, before the Emancipation Proclamation, and as Aaron shared, even after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. So I only have a few slides. I wanted to talk through a few of these with, you know, the line of thinking, but even in those experiences, even in enslavement, even with, you know, parents and children being separated from one another. This didn't just start at the Mexican-US border the last couple of years, right? This country has been doing this for a very, very long time with impunity. And even in the midst of all of this inhumane treatment, these egregious violations of human rights, we still resist, sometimes individually. Imagine that child in bondage, and yet too many times we just weather it and find a way, despite all costs and against the odds, to persevere. So we must continue to build on that spirit of strength. And it's in that spirit that I can celebrate a Juneteenth, which actually used to make me angry to think that 2.5 years after enslaved people, at least in slaveholding states, right? Because there were a lot of caveats. Everyone wasn't freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, quite as it's kept. We've got to just read these documents for ourselves. But even in the midst of, you know, 2.5 years of continued enslavement and lying, yes, there's something to celebrate in our resilience. And so the last two on the right, you all will know, this is Brother Colin Kaepernick, I would say that we talk about martyrs in the sense of the true definition of it. Teresa, I don't know, we've got your slide here. I mean, we've got your here instead of the slide, but what I wanted to mention is that, you know, this young man knew that he was likely sacrificing his career, and not just his career, but what he was born to do. He's an incredible, incredible athlete, but he's also the real deal in terms of his love for his people and being willing to sacrifice everything. So if we can have the slides back, the presentation, yeah. This looks like it's Demetrius's screen. If that could be shared, maybe it's just me. Sorry, because I'm reading from that. So this image is, I'm hoping that you all can see this. This image is, it's Demetrius's screen that we're looking at.
Is there a certain slide that you wanted up?
There you go. Thank you. No, it had shifted to show another participant who was, their video was muted, so I couldn't see what. Yeah, so that, those cornrows on the left side, that's Colin Kaepernick. So what he continued to do, what they could not stop him from doing, was his mission and his passion, which is, this was taken at one of the Know Your Rights camps. And so this is just an encouragement to us. Again, we continue to resist, we continue to build and grow, no matter while we fight, right? So there's just a tremendous amount of respect that I have for this. I think he was 27 at the time that he came to Chicago, and I was able to take some of my teen apprentices to participate at the DuSable Museum for a full day with him and his crew to help train, them in the activism and the strength that it's going to take, because we are at war. We didn't create it, but we're in it, and we're going to have to build on the strength and the blood, sweat, and tears of our ancestors, and use the tools at our disposal. And this is what comes down to human rights. You can, next slide, please. Because the old way of doing things does not work for us anymore. Although I say that with all respect for incredible advances that were made and tremendous wins utilizing the civil rights frame. I'm married to a really wonderful and renowned civil rights lawyer who, Attorney Stan Willis, who has done tremendous work utilizing the civil rights legal framework. And he actually is the person that led many of us to understand that that's a part of the picture. So I didn't include this slide for you all to try to figure out like what's in these tiny little honeycombs and boxes and so forth. But what I wanted to share that's really crucial for us to know, again, we need to read these documents and understand these tools for ourselves, because just like, and thank you, Erin, just like Erin shared about, the media manipulation of images, which we know, right, from the Aunt Jemima to whatever, but also literally to trying to flip the script on the self-determination that the watermelon, images an image for us. In the same way, we can take for granted what the colonizer and the enemy tells us is not possible. And let's stop doing that. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is this tool that, I want to leave you with today, that is basically the next movement building on the civil rights gains that brought us as far as they can. And so what you see is the little blue booklet on the left basically is like the cover of this little booklet, and we can get them to anybody that doesn't have them that wants them. And please, or you can just Google and see a list of them, but there are 30 rights that are enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They call it the UDHR. And to make a long story short, on the right side, what this is a poster that kind of breaks out and categorizes. So what you don't see is that in the civil rights piece is just a subset of the human rights. So there actually are 5, they're more like 7, but I'll talk about the 5 platforms, the human rights really that we need to continue to learn more about and apply locally is the human rights that we think about as civil rights. That's one of them, but there's also economic, social, cultural, civil, and political rights, and then even sexual rights, reproductive rights, and things like that. But what you see in the honeycomb there are the civil and political rights, which, political in the sense of being able to vote, the right to vote, the right to, a fair trial, quote unquote, freedom from slavery, right? Things that we know technically laws can be written, and that's the civil piece. So laws can be written to negate any of those, right? For example, the right to freedom from slavery. Well, we know that the 13th Amendment made a huge exception, right? Which was if you're in prison, if you're incarcerated, if our over-policing puts you in that status, then you can still be enslaved legally in this country. And many, many are, and it's very, very profitable. It is not going to be, they're not going to relinquish it easily. It's just continuation of that incredible international business, that triangle that Attorney Demetrius shared to begin with, that she opened with, made legal. So we use those tools, our fierce civil rights attorneys, and many have just turned into, turned to the human rights frame. In that orange side, you'll see basic rights, like, the things that you need for self-determination, a home, land, food, property, all these other rights, cultural rights, things that our government absolutely was not willing to sign any of those treaties. But these are things that we can force at a local level. So next slide, please. And again, I just urge you to learn about these tools, because the prospect of taking it to the UN or taking it to the United Nations and raising these issues has this stereotype. I included a picture on the left of Eleanor Roosevelt and this Universal Declaration, which is, of those 30 rights that are enshrined in this law that the United States, did agree to and help design and launch and commit to 72 years ago almost now, back in 1948. But the stereotype is that, oh, that's a nice concept, and that applies over in Switzerland, Geneva somewhere, and it's just really not practical, it's not enforceable. And we know from our ancestors, the original We Charge Genocide group in Paul Robeson and folks, decades ago, we learned from Brother Malcolm, said, these are not civil rights issues. These are human issues. These are human rights issues. They're not even just Black issues. They are issues that all of humanity is going to have to deal with, because all of humanity has benefited from these egregious, oppressive policies, this whole system, and it has to be dismantled, and we all have a part to play in that. So the stereotype is that, this is just a nice piece of paper, but it has no juice. Our reality is on the right. There you see a group of Chicago youth in Geneva, Switzerland, doing a silent protest at the time that the US was making their representative was making their normal statement before they even pulled out of the process. They would go and be pretty disruptive and dismissive and talk about all the great things that they do here at home and criticize all of the other countries and nations that are not their friends. So we increasingly are building a US human rights movement. And this is an example of a group which actually took the name of our ancestors, We Charge Genocide, and they were there for silent protests, and also you would call it lobbying, advocating, activism to educate other folks from all around the world who come to all of the issue meetings in Geneva and elsewhere. Because we have a right to participate with an expectation that the US will be held accountable for what we in civil society bring to the table to make them aware of, to refute the whitewashed messages that they get from, the quote unquote official government line from the US, which is reporting on our human rights, So I'm sorry, if you look under that picture, you'll see the 4 mechanisms and 3 treaties and 1 universal periodic review. Emil, can you mute that, please? Sorry. You will see the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. I only have a handful more slides. The CERD is what it's called. There are a lot of acronyms. These are tools that you can use, and we have the resources. There's not enough time to go into the full teaching, that we can do with regard to what benefits each one of them provides, what access, what the timing is. But this is for us. It was written for us to make the appeals that we need to make and then to bring the concluding observations and the findings back home to educate people about them, to inform our allies and ourselves to keep pushing. And then the US is required to respond and to make changes. The second one is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Human Rights, voter suppression and things like that, for example, are critical pieces under there. You have the CAT, the Convention Against Torture, which I'll mention in just a second, a little bit more about how we applied that here in Chicago with a group called Black People Against Police Torture. And then the Universal Periodic Review, which we are working on right now. So I'm sorry to kind of run through these and just throw these at you, but this is an introduction. Welcome follow-up. I really can tell you that we have been able to see a measure of justice in some extremely egregious human rights violations right here locally using the international mechanisms. So next slide. And I'll go through these next three really quickly. Next slide, please. So bringing human rights home, why now? You may know that this is the International Decade for People of African Descent. That came out of basically the Durban 400 is something that you may know of, which was African Americans primarily, 400 strong, who went to the World Conference on Race back right before 9/11 and lobbied successfully the convening there to come away with a determination that the transatlantic slave trade was indeed a crime against humanity. They were not able to actually get the second piece that they were advocating for, which was also to declare that reparations is the remedy. And for all the reasons that were on this call today and the first presentation brought it home, it's because there are serious implications for paying full reparation, but we are owed that. There continues to be momentum toward that end. And coming out of that was initially the international year, coming out of that Durban 400, incredible work on the human rights international front to plead the case of African descendants, including Africans who are descendants of enslaved Africans here in the US. So they had a number of things that came out of that, including the Durban Declaration. And so these are, again, tools where promises have been made. And, just like the Emancipation Proclamation, 2.5 years later, and then even later than that, as Aaron shared, some people still didn't know about it. We have got to educate ourselves and to use these tools. Why now? Why, is this a prime time? Many of us, have been following and commemorating the 1619, the 400th anniversary that just passed of the ship, the first one to officially that arrived with enslaved Africans in North America. So, and the bottom one is that genocide, human rights term, but genocide, we know what that means. It's extermination, and it is real. And we are seeing it played out before our very eyes, and we can't wait. So how do you bring human rights home? These bullet points on the right, I'll go through quickly, but again, when I talked about those treaties on the prior slide, there are specific ways to interact and engage with them. So that includes stakeholders reports, and we have a number of examples of stakeholders reports that were filed. Again, significant amount under the leadership of Attorney Stan Willis, who I'm not bragging on him because he's my husband, but I am bragging on him because he's an example of what someone who wasn't trained in law school on human rights at all, didn't have any reason to think that, however, that the games that were continuing to be played in our courts and in our Congress and in the White House and police stations and so forth, they didn't have any reason to think that we needed to expect someone to give us anything. Our ancestors have taught us that we have to fight for everything, and we will, and we must. So stakeholders reports, basically, it gives us a good opportunity to research the issues ourselves and write them in a very succinct fashion of what are the statistics, what are the issues, what's the impact here, and then what are the demands. So, and then those are filed. And again, as I said before, a response is required for those treaties that have been ratified by the US. For those that have not, we still can hold the local leadership accountable to those human rights standards, but they have to know about it, and they won't know about it, or if they know about it, they're not going to act on it unless we know about it and use those tools and demand it. The others are just, there's the Organization of American States, the IAC is the Inter-American Commission, that's right here in DC, UN working groups. So there are a lot of different formations. We hosted the UN working group of experts on people of African descent back in, I want to say 2016. Their concluding observations, you would like to read that report if you have not already, was very clear, and they played back what they heard in 5 cities, including Chicago, Baltimore, Jackson, Mississippi. Did they go to St. Louis? They did not. We did Chicago Midwest, because this was a time right after Ferguson, Tamir Rice in Ohio. I mean, there were just so many murders again. But their demands, or their concluding observations, that noted that the US is culpable and that reparations are owed. That got a lot of press, and it continues to get a lot of press, and we can see that it has actually sparked and reinvigorated that conversation about the realities of reparations. UN Special Rapporteurs, I'm just going to run through these. These are other tools of how to bring human rights home. Local implementation of international law, which I said before. You can demand it. We educate our local officials, our policymakers, our business owners, ourselves, and we can make this happen. We've done it before. People's tribunals are very important to document and testify what people's actual experiences are. That's how we started learning more about Flint. That's how we started learning about Holman Square here, and examples of torture that are still ongoing. And then grassroots human rights education. We're doing a little bit of that right now. It's very, very critical to keep moving that forward. Next slide, please. And I'm about to wrap up with a couple more. So I spoke to this, Black People Against Police Torture. Most of you, many of you on this call will know about the saga of John Burge and others under his leadership, as well as the whole rotten system, right? The prosecutors, the judges, so many who covered it up. The mayor at the time, who had previously been a state's attorney, Mayor Daley. So the example I just want to say for right now is that, Google these things, but this is a perfect example of bringing human rights home. Never underestimate the power of Black thought leadership, right? Regardless of what this horrible treatment day in and day out, the trauma of it, and we cannot let it steal the reality that there are amazing victories that have been won under the worst circumstances, through courage, through tenacity, through persistence, and a collective intergenerational folks. And Stan would be the first to tell you it was the community, including folks like Attorney Demetrius and a couple of the people on this call who are just family members, community members, educators. There were bus drivers, there were formerly incarcerated, tortured people, survivors, who never told us until the end that they had actually been tortured and done their 20 years, and now they were back out trying to make a difference. So I included a couple of links there. One is an article, law review article that Stan and I did. Another is a very recent one that Toussaint Lossier did. And it's really crucial that we tell our story. I'm saying this, but I know you know it. but I want you to really know it, because even the documentation in, you know, so many locations will just whitewash this history. And we cannot allow that, because then you don't know how much power you might have to use the human rights framework to transform something that is unacceptable. Next slide, please. And so this Chicago was a perfect example of how it really is realistic that we can create human rights cities. And the goal is just, I won't read this to you, but these are basically the 5 core human rights principles. Has to be led by the people, for the people, those most directly affected. And basically, irrespective of what our federal government does, we can move mountains utilizing these tools. We just go around, under, over, through, whatever it takes. And the last point, again, is you can read, these are those points that I was sharing, which is that why human rights? It's because it's so much bigger than civil rights. We're not saying walk away from utilizing civil rights. We're saying that this whole other part of the picture is open to us, and we must use it if we're going to interrupt genocide. The next slide, please. So we are working to build a human rights cities movement. What can you do? Organize. Study to show yourself approved, right? I grew up in church down south, and that's, you know, a common admonishment, but it fits here as well. This is not in the miseducation system. Even the Burge torture curriculum that we fought hard, Black People Against Police Torture's idea, fought hard to have that be a part of the full reparation. A lot of it was co-opted. I'll just say it that way. So we have to learn for ourselves, and we have to teach. Okay, knowing the history is how we're going to defend the future, because if you've noticed, so much of what is coming against us, it's the same thing over and over and over and over, right? So we cannot let the same game be used to lead us further and further to genocide. Another thing you can do is, okay, maybe a lot of people aren't out marching right now, even if they have that spirit, because COVID-19 did not go away, right? So if you can stay at home, you're wise to stay at home. But I honor even more the risks that our youth and allies are taking, who are on the front line and taking it to the streets, because that makes a difference. It scares people into listening, or to coming out from under, from hiding, to really show what they're willing to do, how far they're willing to go to maintain the status quo, which is the honesty that we need to confront so that we know how far we have to go. But if you're not into that, then donate. And a little goes a long way. There's so many really great, there are lots of need right now, right? Lots of need. And those who are suffering the most are the people who have already been pimped by this system that we're talking about, that placed us strategically on the bottom of this rung. So, maybe it's feeding 30 teens, like I've been, working to do, to try to keep helping and supporting my young people who didn't even get to do their graduations and their proms and all those rites of passage, with just a little bit of support and education. Maybe it's donating financially even more. Maybe you can support a human rights project with, Evans International, or maybe invest in the businesses that opportunities that she's speaking about, with regard to considering Africa, because that self-determination strengthens folks. And I'm sorry, I'll end in 1 second. But that self-determination reconnects us with what we were supposed to be disconnected from, right? We continue to maintain the cultural connection and the tangible connection. The African organization, the African group block within the United Nations, the UN Human Rights Council, just this last week, stood up very, very strongly and demanded testimony and inquiry and examination into what's going on here in the US with regards to police murders of Black people. And, you know, we need to build on that and continue that working together. So you can see the last ones. This is really Movement for Black Lives. A lot of people are using that phrase, but you know, there is an organization, Movement for Black Lives, MFBL, and they've done a tremendous job in the last few years to help put forth a platform that a lot of people now are suddenly saying, ooh, that actually probably does make sense. And that divest, invest, redirect funds has been a huge part of that platform for some time. It merits a strong look, and I hope that you all will do that. We have to save our youth. Looking at these last 3 points, we have to save our youth. Think back to that earlier slide with this child, you know, literally just tied and chained and created totally immobile. He was in shackles, just like before the first Juneteenth, just like dragging our people, kidnapping them, selling them, human trafficking into bondage, and we know the rest, rapes and family separations and endless, what's the word, when you just literally grow your wealth, the wealth of the world on our backs, on our shoulders, and through our wombs. We have to save our youth. They are the target, they're the future. We've got to do this. We also have to support our elders, right? We know that from an African descendant cultural center, that's who we are. I don't care what the society is that we're in, we must do that, especially in the time of COVID, but also as dementias and things that this global society, which kills the earth and kills our brains and rapes the planet to be able to grow, well, not to grow food, but I won't even get into the economic racism and the impact of that. But please let's do this, people. It's not about, you know, just right now focusing only on policing. And hopefully this will lead a little bit to the next slide, but the police are the tool of control for the economic control and continued basically stealing our futures and our very lives. So self-care and all of this for sustainable resistance, because it's ugly, but I believe that it's going to get even uglier. We have a human right to thrive, to live, and to be free. And we must continue to work toward that immediately. So the next slide, I think, is the last one. It just has some links to some resources. Yeah. And some of it is about the education and just the earlier pieces that I touched on as I was talking through these slides. Some of it is literal tools, tangible tools with a lot of free resources and information to begin to really delve into the human rights movement, if you will. We need you, and I thank you. Asante sana.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ms. Willis, for going through that. We really appreciated that. Our